Racewatch 12 with Cade Heidemann is brought to you by Builder's Service.
We had a triple-header weekend at Atlanta now pass us by that contained some excellent racing between all three of NASCAR's top divisions. So let's waste no time and head directly into covering what the Truck Series had to offer early Saturday afternoon. William Sawalich, Michael McDowell, Kyle Busch, and Wassa's Luke Fenhaus made up the notable special entries for this race, but the front row belonged to Connor Mozak and Grant Enfinger, the former being the one to pull ahead early in the race. Mozak's lead wouldn't be challenged until the final lap of Stage 1, where the front of the field goes 3 wide, with Jack Wood being the one to prevail over the field. Stage 2 belonged to a different Chevrolet, and it probably shouldn't come as a surprise when I say that it was Kyle Busch making one of his 5 truck starts this year in the Spire 7. He took the stage victory in dominant fashion. The final stretch is where we got our first major caution of the day. 62 to go, Rajah Caruth goes for a ride from the front of the field with huge damage to not only himself, but William Sawalich as well. 12 to go, the field starts getting aggressive with Kyle Busch. A lot of trucks took a run to the front, but every time Busch was able to find a way back around them to re-clear for the lead. This happened all the way up until the white flag. Stuart Friesen was the latest driver to clear Busch, but Busch was not out of it, pulling out a last-second side draft against the 52 to get Kyle in victory lane for the first time this year. We move on now from trucks to Xfinity, and if you thought Kyle Busch winning was a foregone conclusion, Xfinity had a whole different beast with Austin Hill, who up until Saturday had won the last 2 races at Atlanta and had 4 wins there total. With no Cup Series guys dropping down to give Hill a run for his money, things looked to be business as usual almost as soon as the drop of the green flag. Jesse Love and Hill led the field to green, and not once did any other driver get close through all of Stage 1. The RCR duo finished out Stage 1 first and second, fending off a late charge from Sam Mayer. Stage 2 ended no different. Even without Jesse Love there to support Hill, he still managed to hold the field back of him to the line. HFT teammates Sam Mayer and Sheldon Creed finished second and third behind him. 22 to go, we get a big wreck involving one of those front-running cars, Sam Mayer. He ends his day in the roughest way possible, taking Anthony Alfredo with him. 3 to go, Justin Allgaier and Eric Almirola both had shots to steal one from Austin Hill, but Hill was just too good. Hill retook the 19 in turn 1, and from there, it was all over. Even despite a major wreck down the back, the race ran green to the checkered, with Austin Hill prevailing at Atlanta once again. It's been an all-Chevy weekend so far, but on Sunday for the Ambetter Health 400, one team looked to end the weekend with a Ford in victory lane. The race kicked off in dominant fashion for Team Penske, who locked out the front 2 rows alongside the Associated Wood Brothers 21 and Josh Berry, and it would be the latter who had a stand-up performance in the first stage. Berry was up front all of Stage 1 en route to collecting his second career stage victory. Stage 2, the Chevrolets mounted a comeback with who else but Kyle Larson taking the green and white amongst a sea of his competitors. But by race's end, it was right back to being Penske versus the world, until incrementally the Penske cars fell one by one. First, Carson Hocevar punted Ryan Blaney, and while the 12 was able to mount a comeback, the same could not be said for Austin Cindric, who gets walled by Kyle Larson and is sent through the field colliding with the backstretch wall, which also ends the day of last week's winner William Byron. Now in overtime, the final lap was a duel between Kyle Larson and Christopher Bell. While they did take the white flag, they would not make it back to the line before the caution came out again for a destroyed Josh Berry. With the winner being the driver who was ahead at the time of caution, it was determined to be Christopher Bell, stealing one when all the Toyota drivers were barely in the conversation all race, and securing himself a spot in this year's playoffs. I'm joined now by Newswatch 12's Wyatt Williams. Wyatt, thanks for joining the show again.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad.
So I want to lead off with this from the Daytona 500. Now, do you remember the crash between Ricky Stenhouse and Joey Logano towards the end of that race?
Pretty memorable. It wiped out a lot of guys who should have been in contention there down the stretch, including the guy who wrecked himself to get out of the race. So, yes, it was quite memorable.
So I asked the community last week, who do they think was at fault for that crash? And the results, I have them here. 50% of the vote went to Joey Logano and 38% of the vote went to Ricky Stenhouse Jr. Do you agree with that?
To a sense, yes. I think Joey should not have been making the moves that he was making with 15 to go, like we're coming to the checkered flag. But at the same time, I definitely think that Ricky shouldn't have forced the issue in the middle there like that. So it's so tough. And I think that's why, like, when you look at it, and I've seen a lot of Twitter polls too with this, like, it seems pretty split. Yeah, there's a favorite sometimes and everything, but I think it's a little bit of both. I think Joey shouldn't have been forcing the issue as much with 15 to go, and I think Ricky probably shouldn't have been throwing 3 wide blocks in the middle of the pack.
It really felt like Joey was racing for the win when it really just wasn't at that point. Like, he had a really fast car that day. He came from the back all the way back up to the front after having, I think, a throttle body issue.
Twice.
He didn't need to really do that to himself. And then he took out a bunch of good cars along with it. So I'm with the community here. I think Joey Logano was the one at fault here. But we should fast forward to this week's action at Atlanta. And one of the more controversial topics from there was Carson Hocevar creating a lot of enemies over this weekend. Firstly, with Kyle Busch, who Kyle was just not happy with the way Carson was racing him. He didn't like outright wreck him or anything. He just wouldn't let him go by. And then later on, we saw him dump Ryan Blaney outside of turn 2. So do you think that Carson could recover from this next week and, hopefully not get himself dumped by these newfound not friends of his?
Yeah, I think this is something where Carson is a very talented driver, definitely an up-and-coming driver in our sport. And drivers are going to be more patient, more lenient with that. But I think that patience will run out eventually. And I do think that we're kind of starting to get to that point. Ross Chastain, I think, might have saved him by pulling him into the grass and having that original talk with him so nobody else could get to him first. But, Kevin Harvick mentioned on his podcast this week, as long as you've got the shoulders to handle this pressure, keep your foot in the gas. I don't really have a problem with the moves that he was making, more necessarily the way that the drivers are going to react. We kind of saw this with Ross Chastain a couple of years ago, and he has curbed back a little bit. And I'm wondering if Carson's going to, or if he's just going to put the foot through the floor and keep moving forward.
Now, it's interesting you brought up Ross Chastain pulling Carson aside, because I had saw on Twitter, I think it was from Bob Pockrass, that when he asked Chastain if he had gotten what he wanted to hear out of Hocevar, he replied, "No, sir." So I assume that conversation didn't exactly go well, and I'm a little curious to see if there's any change in Hocevar this next week, if he races a little bit cleaner, or if he's just going to, as you said, like Kevin Harvick said, where he just pedal to the metal, just try to get it done the way you can.
Yeah, I think that's what's made him into what he is a great racer in our sport, and racing in Spire equipment. There's nothing wrong with Spire, but they typically run in the mid to back of the pack. And for him to have that car up into second, you have to make those aggressive moves. You have to do those things that people aren't necessarily going to like when you're fighting for the win. And I think that's what Carson was doing overall. Definitely there are some moments where you should curb it back in a little bit. I think that the Ryan Blaney issue you mentioned earlier, maybe square up when you bump a guy, or just don't bump them in the turn at all. That usually helps. Mm-hmm. So I think that guys are and have been very patient with him, but I think we could see that patience run out soon.
So now from what people consider a dirty driver from this last week to someone who ran a really good race unexpectedly, Josh Berry. He won his second career stage at Atlanta in stage 1 and had a really just good performance taking that Wood Brothers car alongside the Penske cars. It didn't feel like a fourth car in that instance. It felt like the performance of that car was up alongside the 212 and the 22. So what do you think this implies for the rest of his season? Do you think he can capitalize on this momentum? I
think Josh Berry is a great driver. And I was really surprised that Rodney Childers didn't stay with him and went on to Spire. But yeah, the 21 looked great this weekend. It really did. I think this is the best we've seen the 21 since Ryan Blaney was in it. And they've got great equipment. They work with the Hendrick guys. They're in meetings with them all week. And Josh Berry, like I said, is a very talented driver. So I think that this could show a lot of great things to come. And this is not even Josh's niche. He's a short track racer. Mm-hmm. So once we see, if he's already doing this good on the draft tracks, the restrictor plate tracks, whatever you want to call it, I think it just shows the upward motion of his career, how talented he is, and where they could go. We saw him fill in for both guys 2 years ago at Hendrick Motorsports whenever Chase Elliott had broke his leg, and then whenever Alex Bowman had the back issue, and he drove that equipment really well. So, I think this is a good driver in good equipment for the first time in a while with this 21 car. And I think it's kind of showing through again, and it's becoming a relevant ride.
I agree as well. And now lastly, we're going to fast forward to next week at COTA. And I just want to ask you, what do you think your pick is? Mine personally, I'm going with Kyle Larson this week. I think he's always a good driver, and I think he's just looking for that break. He only got a stage victory so far this season, and he's had a really just tough couple weeks. I think that this week could be where he locks in that playoff spot. What do you got?
I'm going to be eyes glued to the Red Bull guys. SVG has looked so good ever since he got into the Cup Series, and this is his niche. This is where he succeeds, racing on these road courses after racing supercars for so long. Won his first race ever in the Cup Series on a road course. So I think that's someone I'm going to be watching, but I'm definitely going to also be watching Connor Zilisch. I think that's going to be really cool to see both of those guys out there. And this is our first taste of dumping the 18-year-old phenom into the Cup Series and kind of seeing what he can do. So like I said, I'm really excited about these Red Bull drivers. I'm really going to be eyes glued to them and seeing what they're doing. So I got SVG for the win, but definitely going to be watching Zilisch as the day goes on.
My eyes will also be on the 88 and the 87. Thanks for joining me again this week, Wyatt.
Here's your Wisconsin driver update. Luke Fenhaus in his first truck race of the year really had a standout day. A lot of drivers towards the end were taking runs and passing Kyle Busch for the lead. Fenhaus was one of those drivers, officially leading 2 laps of the race. He fell off a little later on, but still secured a 14th place finish after starting 13th. It is currently unknown when exactly his next start will be, however with runs like these, it is likely we will be seeing him in the 66 again very soon. Then Ty Majeski once again puts together a solid day, being the second best finishing ThorSport truck, one spot behind his teammate Ben Rhodes. As has been the case for the past couple years, Majeski getting another truck win feels like an inevitability. The defending champ already has some good points behind him heading into the 2-week break. In Xfinity, things were quite a bit worse for the Wisconsin drivers. Sam Mayer being the worst of the bunch this week after having finished runner-up last week. He was involved in the horrible wreck alongside Anthony Alfredo. Josh Willicke didn't fare much better, only being able to bring home a 30th place finish. Then the best of the bunch this week was Parker Retzlaff, who just like last week was having a very good day up until the final few laps where he was once more caught in a wreck that wasn't his fault, sending him from the front down to his final finishing position in 27th. Next week is COTA, and I fully expect a huge turnaround from these guys. Sam Mayer currently has 4 road course wins to his name, his latest being last year's Roval, and then Josh Bilicki has always managed to pull relatively strong finishes at road courses in less than stellar equipment, placing 8th at last year's Roval. That's all we have for this week's edition. For Racewatch 12, I'm Cade Heidemann.